Hello, and thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks to all the people who made this very nice conference happen. My lecture or my presentation is called Instrument to Studio. I'm Florian Zwissler. I teach at the Music Academy in Cologne, Hochschule für Musik und Tanz, where I'm teaching improvisation with a focus on electronic instruments. I think I have to explain a little what I mean or why I chose this title, and I hope it will keep the move further onward on the path that has just been prepared by the preceding lectures. So what does that mean? I have been doing a bit of research on electronic music in a research project called Preset, which was a slightly ironic title. And in the course of that, I had the opportunity also to go through the archives of the studio of Columbia, the electronic music studio. That is, of course, a connecting point to Harald Bode. So there's quite a bit of letters having been exchanged between him and Ussachevsky. As you know, I was also in the lucky state of working with one of the early versions of his frequency shifter there. In the course of this project, a lot of questions were dealt with, and a few questions that still remain are, in my opinion, really basic ones, like the notion of the instrument within the context of electronic music. The term has been used today already, and I think it's always a good idea to maybe question the term. And I think that is, or questioning these two terms also makes, characterizes the position of Harald Bode within the storyline of electronic music in the 20th century. It's a very specific position. I think he's quite a unique figure, and that is my basic hypothesis for the next minutes that I'm going to try to sketch out. The earliest incident where I heard the name Harald Bode was when I moved to Cologne in the late 90s to study musicology. At the time, the institute was strongly connected to the topic of electronic music and to the then still existing Studio für elektronische Musik of the West German Radio. And of course, I got to know about all the history and of course of the famous Hausmitteilungen Sonderheft of 1953. And of the fact that in the very first set of devices that were the equipment of this historic studio, there was an instrument built by somebody called Harald Bode, which is the melochord, of course, and was the instrument, as I later learned, that, for example, was used for the very first pieces that were produced in the studio by Herbert Eimert, Robert Bayer, and before that also by Werner Meyer-Eppler, who was a very important figure in outlining the concept for what was going to happen in the Studio für elektronische Musik. Meyer-Eppler himself used the melochord a lot to produce audio examples. He was actually teaching phonetics and information communication or science at the University of Bonn, and was also a teacher of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen later. So there we are with an instrument that was part of a studio. I will sketch out what I think is very specific about this. As you all know, the melochord is not the first thing that Harald Bode developed, but I'd like to put him into context of what happened in the first half of the 20th century. And I think what was the work that had been done in these days was really focused on things you would want to call an instrument. I am fully convinced that you all have seen, you all know of the very early days and of the very first instruments like the dynamophone or telharmonium, for example. One of the very first attempts to fully create an instrument that is working on an electronic or electric way of generating sound. It's pretty easy for us to identify this as an instrument because there's an instrument playing interface, as we all see, with a chromatic keyboard. And if you're ignoring the fact that the dynamophone was interesting for a ton of reasons, also because it was connected to a very interesting music distribution concept as well, it's still considered to be an instrument, I would say. Of course, it was like the predecessor of the Hammond organs because it basically generates its tone in the same ways with all the nice tone wheels rotating inside. So there's still a mechanical aspect going on. Other developments, also very well known, started to focus on purely electronic generation of tones. So we have circuitry that actually vibrates. So we get rid of the rotation of the tone wheels as we find them in the dynamophone or the Hammond organ. The theremin is one of the first instruments that uses circuitry to actually, whatever we want to call it, synthesize or generate vibrations. Of course, in the meantime, the vacuum tube had been invented and facilitated lots of developments, such as also, I mean, I'm just throwing a few examples of these years of very rich developments. A German example would be the Trautonium. I had the chance to see Oskar Sala, who's depicted here in this room, I think, in 1997 or 98. And while also, for example, the Trautonium is usually being looked at as a predecessor of synthesizers, also because Oskar Sala remained active in the second half of the 20th century. I still think there's it's quite strongly connected to a more or less classic concept of being an instrument. The well-known Warburg-Formant organ, one of the very first projects by Harald Bode, as you all know, is located in this historic era. So we're in this should be about the time of the picture we saw before of Oskar Sala, like the mid-30s. I think you could argue that Harald Bode's way of thinking already projected into future developments. You probably know the basic working principles of the Formant organ, and one of the interesting aspects is that it is considered, or the basic layout is actually a little bit like a polyphonic synthesizer that you would rather expect to find in the late 70s, like the instruments following the Prophet 5 that we just saw in the video, for example, where you have to deal with questions like voice assignment and all that, and you incorporate envelope generators and have a very modular way of thinking about producing sound. And also the succeeding instrument, the melodium, that was only had one voice, but it allowed a lot of playing control, which makes it, of course, an instrument. I mean, it's a Bode called this an organ, and there was no doubt that these instruments were equipped with a keyboard. Still, there is some progressive thinking, I would say, within his early projects. So this is what happened in the times before the Second World War, before 1950, and starting from around 1950, there's an important change in history. It's been depicted in a slightly different manner before. I think it's a very important moment. I would agree, a very important moment in music history, if we focus on the studio thing. Also a picture lots of you may have seen before. It's one of the famous pictures of one of the first incarnations, not the very first one, but of the first incarnations of the Studio für elektronische Musik in Köln, and we hardly see any keyboards here. We also don't see the Melo chord anymore, so it can't be the very first picture. A change had taken place by incorporating, I mean, I'm trying to find a short formula for this, but I would think that incorporating the production medium, speaking of the tape machine, into the production logic of creating sound and of binding together the idea of composition and sound creation is one crucial aspect that changed the overall idea of what you could do with electronic means and with the option to create sound in the electronic medium. This was done from different perspectives. We all know there have been a few very famous studios in the early days, and we all know that also in Paris things were done strongly focused on the production process also. I mean, the production medium, like the records of the early days and the tape machines, and this is an interesting twist to my storyline actually, because of course here we have a keyboard again attached to basically what is basically a rather complex tape machine. So all the devices that were designed at the later GRM, all the morphogenes and phonogenes, also thought about a way of dealing with the material you were involved in. So what I'm trying to say is the invention of the studio as a place to conceive sound, to construct sound, to produce sound, offered a new way of thinking about electronic sound generation. And I present you with a quote that I like a lot. It's by Robert Bayer, who was one, I just mentioned the name, he was a companion of Herbert Eimert in the production of the very first pieces of the WDR studio. He was involved in the founding of the studio, but left soon afterwards. he published this, or the quote is taken from an article he wrote in Melos in 1954. There's quite an interesting article he did also already in the 20s, called Vom Problem der kommenden Musik, which is also worth reading. But I think this one is for the moment a good thing to think about. I'll just read it for you. The material basis of electronic music differs fundamentally from that of previous music. The decisive moment lies in the liberation of sound from the limitations of musical notation and the body-bound way of producing sound that is in harmony with it. The tendency to liberate sound from its organic confines inevitably lies in technical development. Just as the individual machine remains dwarfed as long as it is moved by man, electronics will not develop their powers as long as they are confined within the limits of manual playing. The commercially available electronic instruments still present themselves in the traditional physical form of the tool. They have not yet developed into the form that is appropriate for electronics and it incorporates its full range of possibilities. I think this is quite a strong statement that explains or that opens up the strong shift that had been taken by going into the studio and reconsidering the tools. He calls it the tools you used. Everybody knows probably the famous or the legend that Stockhausen went to the measuring department to grab hold of sine wave generators to use them together with the studio and all the tape machines to create the sine wave pieces like Studie 1 and Studie 2. And also these pieces, I think, are an interesting basis of discussion, asking whether you would find any instrument within the production of these pieces. I mean, you can argue from wherever you want. There's lots of positions, I think, that can possibly be taken in that. So, getting back to Harald Bode, it's quite interesting that his Melo chord landed in the WDR studio just at the moment where things took into a different direction. And despite the Melo chord being a super interesting instrument with very forward-thinking possibilities, the basic strategies that were that became the standard use of technology in the WDR studio took a different path. I think it's really fascinating to look at the way Bode took, or the path he would move along in the following years. Going to America, working for an organ company sounds basically like a conservative step, staying within the instrument logic. But apart from a lot of other creations that we already have discussed, I think it's super interesting to take into account that he actually made this step to design a tool that is really pretty close to what we later identified as the synthesizer. So this basic outline and rough sketch, and probably strong inspiration to Bob Moog and Don Buchla, his outline of the modular synthesizer, interestingly combined with the tape machine, may I add. So the medium is incorporated into the whole process. So yeah, for me that sketches Bode's readiness to, on the one hand, be rooted in the classic instrument building tradition, but also being flexible enough to keep thinking forward and to present the world with, yeah, basically the outline of what would become the synthesizer. And this is like a basic drawing of what you would find. I mean, basically everything is there. You have a set of modules that can be set into communication to communicate via voltages. You have generators, filters, envelopes. You have the opportunity to use external material to be processed. And my hypothesis would also be that this type of setup wouldn't have been possible without the detour over the electronic studios that were based on the work with the production medium, the tape. As we know, Harald Bode was strongly connected to the studio at Columbia and was, of course, informed on all the present developments. And also Columbia, the studio, Usashevsky and Luning had been informed, or very closely informed, of what had been going on in Europe over the course of the 50s, for example. So to sum up, I would just say that Bode appears to be a very interesting figure that binds together two actually pretty different worlds of the historical development of electronic music in the 20th century, but has been part of a few very crucial steps. And if you see the Minimoog here, I'm not trying to, I don't mean the Minimoog as a specific machine, but just as well, as an image that represents maybe something that most people would agree on as this is a synthesizer, and maybe this is an instrument, not only because it's got a chromatic keyboard, but to appreciate the fact that this development, the process or the progress being made also within Bode's work, means that we have a new type of instrument, maybe it's still questionable whether it's an instrument, but having created this new reality, or co-created this new reality, that opened up the possibilities that led to all the further developments until today, and that are still valid in the way we think about electronic music or electronic sound production. Thanks. Any questions? Yes.
What Florian presented, otherwise here.
Yes. Also objections or anything, please.
To you, like observing this synthesizer in the studios, and how would you define what is the instrument and what is the studio? Because in my opinion, instrument always has memory, and it's kind of also a memory device or a memory an instrument for memory, because just a flute, it record all the scale that you could play on it, and the median and like in functional programming, the data and the function is indistinguishable. How do you see it in the perspective of studio and instrument?
Thanks. Oh, that's quite a question. Yeah, you made this very nice example of the flute and also the recorder. That is a recorder, yes, of course. I came to understand that just a few years ago. I mean, I think it depends on whether you actually need to define it. My observation, just trying to explain why I think it's disputable, is that people use the terms a lot and that people want to make a distinction. On the one hand, you have I used this very placative Minimoog portrait because everybody thinks, yeah, I get it. A synthesizer is an instrument, which was probably also the proof made by things like Switched on Bach, which meant to people, okay, I get it. It's an instrument because you can play it and because it's got a keyboard. So there's one way of understanding instruments from that side. I'm not fully sure, for example, what is the instrument of Studie 2, for example. It doesn't make sense to I mean, you could claim that you could use a sine wave generator as an instrument. It's possible, but I wonder whether this notion of instrument works well in other contexts then. It's not a complete answer, actually. Yet. I'll keep processing, but
I think it's the math.
Sorry?
Mathematics is the instrument of studio.
Oh, wow. Maths is the instrument? All right. I haven't thought of that. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Hi, I'm over here. Hi, thanks. Yeah, this is really great, super, and I'm sort of coming from video and film world, so I'm sorry if this is a clueless question. But what struck me about this question of instrument to studio is also a question of like, how, like the question of like how something is being used versus where it's being used, and I wonder if you can comment on sort of that idea, and maybe that goes to like what the instrument is like. Is it about the how of its usage, or is it about the where of it being shifted? Because like in video, the shift to like artist practice in studio, like Bruce Nauman or something, right? Is this really important moment there? And it's maybe not a direct correlate, but I was just thinking about the where of the studio, and if that leans into a question of production process or a different way of artists, engineers, composers thinking about
what would
this.
you think about things like this? I maybe might call it mobilized painting of like the 20s. Sure. That are connected to film, of course, and film editing, right? So yeah, lots of questions implied in that. One thing that is in part maybe also an answer to the question before. I still owe a few answers. When you look at the history, maybe also of like the historical development of equipment in studios, it's quite interesting to see. You have this, you might call it nowadays, classical age of electronic music in the 50s, 60s, where you basically have technology that is very much not, that doesn't give you the feeling that it's very comfortable to use. And then you have the turn to commercial music instruments or commercial tools like the Moog or the Buchla or the EMS Synthie 100, whatever. Staying at the WDR studio, you have in the mid-70s, the Synthie 100 being delivered to the studio, and you have a big change, of course, in the strategies that you choose, because now you have to deal with an instrument, for example, or like a very strongly pre-structured device that is still very flexible, but that already incorporates a few decisions having been made for you, making things much more comfortable, but then again, being sort of pre-structured. And this is also, interestingly, quite a question nowadays, because as some of you may know, there's a project going on. It's moving very slowly, as usual, to resurrect or reopen the WDR studio. And of course, nowadays you will put up the question, okay, if we reopen it, what is possible? How much space will we have? But what do we mean by reopening it? Which are the tools that we have to make accessible again? Is it interesting to equip the new studio with a DX7 that was bought in the 80s? Is it crucial? Is an Emax2 sampler interesting? What about all the computers that have been bought in the 80s, right? So there's I would think there is a sort of a change in quality of technology and of the way technology was seen. And I think basically that the notions of instrument and studio are basically points of orientation where you tend to move towards or away from. Maybe you don't actually have to define the terms, really. Also, if you want, you can shift everything to digital. Is a plug-in of a Minimoog an instrument? Is it a synthesizer? I don't know. I don't know. I think we don't have to define it always. Okay.
This makes me think of Pauline Oliveros and her notion of deep listening as a compositional strategy. But deep listening, this is a bit of a stretch maybe, but her early work involved tape recorders. And the tape center that she set up at Mills College was about making the tape recorder available. And there's some stories in New York of, I don't remember the couple that had the first tape recorder that John Cage made an important piece or two. I'm not remembering, I don't remember the name of the piece. But the point is, the tape recorder was such an important contribution to electronic music, not just in the utility fashion that you could record, but that you could really carefully listen to things, really carefully listen. And many of those recordings actually didn't become available until the 90s with CDs, because there wasn't a tape distribution system in place. It was vinyl records, and that was extremely limited and almost a fluke in the States when electronic music was on albums. The story often was it was because there was an electronic composer, musician who happened to work at the record company who convinced the executives that they probably could sell and make a decent profit, or at least not lose too much. And so we really had actually very little access to listening to the recordings until another technology came by. And I'm just bringing up this point around the tape recorder because it's in these studios that you're describing. It's such an important piece because it really it allowed a deep listening. And then you have a set of next instruments, which maybe the Moog was really part of that then became performative so that you could perform it in another space, which maybe connects to what James was just talking about. So in any case, not to say we have to celebrate the tape recorder, but to just acknowledge that it is such such an important part of the experience, and it's why we actually learn to listen to electronic music.
Yeah, thank you. I think I couldn't agree more. And of course, Pierre Schaeffer's writings covered this in some ways. I mean, he describes this, and the whole approach of the Musique Concrète is also, I think, fully rooted in the experience of the media experience of listening, and then in the next step of manipulating. But the listening is the first step, and that changes a lot. Thank you.
I think one aspect was you were mixing the two expression of instrument and tool. And I think to answer that question we were discussing right now is everything is a tool, but instrument is something which has a certain stereotypical definition. Yeah, since when one person creates a piano, it's not an instrument. It's an instrument when several people uses a piano and develop a kind of music. And I think for us it is not so important, the piano or the definition of an instrument. I think for us electronic composers, it's important the idea of a tool. And that's the main aspect. And everything you use to make music, even if just to record and playback, what my predecessor was saying, that makes a recording machine a tool.
I thanks for like relighting this aspect. I totally agree that it's in the end not really important to fully define things. My experience was that the possible ambiguity of these notions are usually or are often found in discussing these topics, and the urge to define something as one of the two or as something seems to be crucial to a lot of people. So that was basically one of my first inspirations to deal with all these issues. So plus the fact that when you look at this moment in around 1950, where something really different, like something specific happens, it seems to be pretty clear that there's a distinction in some ways. But then again, if you look at if you look in detail, it's going to be blurry again, of course. But it's also, it could be an interesting. The notions can be a tool to test also the way you look at things, for example. Yeah.
So many thanks, Florian. I think at this point we should move on to the. Okay, do you have an urgent question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
No. It's meant to become a living studio, but yeah, I'm not gonna guess when the opening ceremony will be.
Is this in reach or is this in 20 years?
It's officially in reach.
Okay.
No. That's actually one of the questions I was planning to ask, because I have no knowledge where the mellow chord went. Do you know? You don't. Okay. Okay.
So thank you, Florian. Then we should move forward to our last panel discussion, and maybe we have to shorten it a little bit because some of the people involved have to switch over to University of Music to prepare for the concert this night. And I would invite Rebecca Parloff and Senta Hirscheider to the podium. And Florian will stay here.